Welcome to this discussion of text. Now, when we say text, we mean a lot of things. For example, we say textbook or textine. And in both these, there is meaning, language, culture, a wide amount of information that's being expressed. And we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about very specific things about text. And it's going to start with this idea of type. Now, type is both a verb in regard to typing, which I'm doing now, entering information into my computer with my keyboard and having that information displayed on the screen as type. Type always looks a certain way. And we can divide this into two different topics, which will become the topics of our conversation today. The first of these is font. Now, font refers to the look and feel of each of the different characters in a type or in a text. For example, F is one character in the word font. And this specific F has a certain look and feel. This O has a similar look and feel, the N and the T. And when combined together, they all look the same and are legible and readable. Font also expresses a specific mood or feeling. Now we're going to get into this later, but the point being that font is not the same thing as another very important aspect to type and text, and that is typography. Now, typography is very important, and it refers to the art of arranging type. And it's specific that this is an art to arranging type. Now, when we arrange things or make them look a certain way, it affects the person reading them. It affects the person experiencing them. And whether you're talking about typography or font, both of these things can affect them in what can be boiled down to two different categories. First, it can make them feel or understand something a certain way. It can give expression. It can give value. It can give meaning. Also, it can allow the reader to understand what you're saying easy. So, for example, if it's hard for them to read the font or read the paragraph or read the sentence, they will be less inclined to actually understand your meaning and to participate. In many ways, typography is the art of making things legible, making things readable, allowing your reader to come into your conversation and participate fully. In fact, the word typography comes from the idea of typos, which means impression or form, and graphia, which means writing. Now, both these words have a lot of history behind them, and I encourage you to look them up to fully understand what the art of arranging type is. But for now, we're going to dive into these two things, font and typography, to learn more about how they relate to the way we work on computers and the way our digital and physical text and type-based documents behave in the world. All right, now before we get into the bulk of this discussion on text, type, font, and typography, I'm going to make a few notes about how we're going to do this. First of all, you might have noticed that I'm working within a computer program, specifically the program Illustrator. Illustrator is a great program. It does a great job working with vectors and lines, which fundamentally are type or text or fonts. It might not be the best program for working with large bodies of text, and it might not be the worst program for working with large bodies of text, but it is a very good program. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to do this discussion within Illustrator. And we're going to look at things like the properties panel. And what do these topics mean? What are these various icons? And how do they relate to the lingo or the words that are associated with both fonts and typography? So as we move through this, we are just going to give an overview. And the intention is that when you open a program like Illustrator or Word or Google Docs or InDesign or anything else that fundamentally helps you manipulate text and type, you won't be so confused about all these different things, and you'll know the basis that you should work from. In addition, a lot of the information is coming from two great sources. One is a LinkedIn Learning resource called Typography, Choosing and Combining Typefaces, within which Ina Saltz talks about font specifically in its different forms, the historical context of it, using neutral fonts or superfamilies, all these very deep topics that really deserve to be talked about, that won't be addressed in this introductory discussion. The other resource is an amazing free online publication. This free thing not only gives you a 10-minute explanation of typography, the do's and don'ts, but it also is this amazing index of all different topics and conversations. I highly encourage you to check this out and look at things like line numbers, block quotations, rules and borders. Now we'll be talking about some of the basics using the information they're providing here, but you really should check out these resources that both Matthew and Ina have put together. Let's talk about fonts first. Now, fonts are inherently complex because there's so many of them in the world. They've been designed for years and years and years. They've gone through different renditions, different topics. There's a current status quo of fonts, things that work, things that don't work. And everyone seems to have their own opinion of fonts. Now, I'm not going to tell you which fonts are best and which fonts are not good, but I am going to describe what fonts are and how we can make informed decisions, or at least probe into what fonts to use. The first question we have to ask is, how do we get different fonts? Now, the easy answer to this is, well, use the computer program. If you notice, I'm selecting this text input, and if I go over to the properties, I can see that the character panel is telling me that the font family is Courier. Now I've picked this font family to start off specifically because it actually is based off of old typewriter fonts. Courier was a font developed to replicate that, and therefore it looks like what would be produced. There's a lot of history behind the Courier font. It's very interesting if you would like to check it out. But we are now going to look at all these different kinds of fonts that we can use. So if we just start scrolling through the fonts, we can see that there's amazing diversity, and that every time we change a font, something new shows up on the screen. It gives us a different impression of what's going on. Illustrator and other computer programs do a good job of showing us these fonts, allowing us to pick them. But if we're not careful, we end up just scrolling through fonts without any basis for what we're going to do. Now, this isn't the only place that we can look at fonts. There's also other places that we can get fonts. These fonts happen to be the ones that we can access through Illustrator. We can find fonts online. We can buy fonts. We can also make our own fonts. But I'm going to introduce one other resource, which stands, I think, at a different side of the spectrum from the fonts that we have accessible on our computers or that are accessible by purchase. and that's Google Fonts. And the reason I bring this up is because Google Fonts, if we open it, fonts.google.com, is a free resource of fonts. Now there's a lot of controversy around this open source or free fonts. And the controversy exists because people believe that if you're not paying for it or that there's no compensation, they're not quite as good. This is maybe the case or maybe not the case. But the point is that, again, whether you're looking at fonts via a free open resource or you're on your computer and you're looking at the different fonts that are accessible in the menu, you should find some way to narrow down these searches. But before we do that, let's talk about how we actually decide what fonts to use based on what we're looking at. We don't always know exactly what we need to type. The words don't always come. Writer's block is a very real thing. And as we sit down, as I am right now, thinking about what I need to type, I'm not sure what I have to say. That doesn't have to get in the way of us creating beautiful fonts and typography. So let's talk about a couple of ways that we can probe into these topics without having to know what we have to say. If I was to start my text tool in Illustrator and just click somewhere else, it's going to drop in this text. So that was a single click, and here we're just going to do a click and drag to make a box. And I can see that it's already put font in there for me, and that this font looks convincing. It's like it's already written something in a language I can't understand. Well, what this is it's Lorem Ipsum, and it's a fake font or a filler font. Illustrator does a good job of providing this filler font when we want, giving us the option to insert filler font or placeholder text when we need to, when we don't know the words we have to say, but we know we need to make it look good and lay it out. And just for a moment, it's interesting where this Lorem Ipsum came from. Now, it does look like real font, and actually, it does come from a text back in history by Cicero. And the text is titled On the Extremes of Good and Evil. Now, this is actually just kind of nothing. It doesn't mean anything. You can't translate this. But it was someone who knew that they would need to use filler text because it was important for them to look just at the layout of things instead of having to concentrate on what they were saying. And they just jumbled around the words of this old text by Cicero. Interestingly enough, the first phrase that always appears, Lorem Ipsum, Lorem is actually not a full word. It's de Lorem Ipsum, and this means pain in and of itself. All right, let's get rid of that. And let's just talk also briefly about two other things we might see when we're looking at fonts, or the way we imagine fonts. One of them is very simple. It's this idea of Hello World. And the reason I bring this up is because Hello World was some of the first things that computer programs printed on the web, right? It was this ability for us to write something and have it be reproduced, much as I'm doing now. And the phrase was Hello World. So you might see this around. It's a good way to understand what the font is or what it's looking like. Another phrase you might see when trying to understand what a font looks like is the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Now maybe you've seen this or maybe you haven't, but what's interesting about this is it's been used for ages by teachers because it contains every letter of the alphabet. It was somewhat of a practice sentence for children learning how to trace and draw these things. And therefore, you can start to get a good idea of what all the different letters and things of a certain font look like when they're put together. All right, but enough of this. Let's get into actually what these fonts are and how we make decisions about them. I'm going to fill my text box here with, oops, let's actually delete that, do that one more time. All right, so now we have some just random text that we're going to look at fonts with. And if we open up our character or our properties, and we look at all these different things, they do look similar and different from each other. Now, up at the top, we have these filters, and we're going to filter by classification. The classifications of fonts are primarily defined as sans serif, or without serifs, and serifs, or serif, with serifs. Now, let's filter into just the sans serifs, and let's look at a very standard font, which is Arial. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about Arial later as a font choice, but for now, the point being is that a sans serif font is a blocky font. Everything is very fixed. There are no additions. It's a good font when you're doing titles or things that are used to kind of make a statement. Let's look at a different kind of font, turn our filter on, and go to our serif font, and pick perhaps one of these. Doesn't really matter what. How about this one? Okay. So now this is a serif font. And what the serifs are is they are these little moments at the bottom or top of each character that create lines and traces. And actually, as I hover over this, you can see that there's a strong horizontal line defined by this font, by all these little serifs. The reason why serifs exist is primarily to help guide the reader, guide their eye, so that they move across a line as they read. And because of this, serif type fonts typically get used when you have a large body of font, because the eye doesn't want to have to focus on every letter. It wants to be guided across. So as a standard rule, you want to use sans serif type fonts for your headings or your titles, and you want to use serif fonts for your bodies or your large groups of text. And this comes back to the concept that your readers want things to be easy. They want things to be convenient so that they can really focus on what you're trying to say instead of focusing on trying to deal with the font you've chosen. Now, we also have slab serif type fonts, and we'll pick one of these. Now, the reason why these are slab serif is because their serifs are very blocky. They're a different subcategory of serifs. They actually, to some degree, are a combination of sans serif and serif. They might perhaps be serif type fonts that would be used for titles, as their blockiness kind of pauses you as you move across the text. We also have script type fonts. These fonts are very, very expressive, maybe perhaps beautiful. So let's go back and change that font there. They're quite beautiful. They're very flowing. They definitely created a certain mood. And this would be an example of something that you're doing to have an expression as opposed to something you're doing to make things easier. Of course, the reader might feel better when they're looking at a poster or a board or an advertisement, and they might want to buy into the message more. But if they're having to participate with what you're saying, these types of fonts are not the kind of fonts that you want to use. Now, there are some other font types that we can check out. So we have black letter, we have monospaced, we have handwritten, and we have decorative. And these fonts get very, very crazy and exciting and fun and hard to read and all these different kinds of things. So when you're making choices, please make sure that you understand that these choices have to be looked at from the view of, what am I trying to accomplish? Am I trying to make a statement, or am I trying to allow my reader to understand what I'm saying and not make it harder for them? Basically, while we're working with fonts, there's a simple rule to follow, and that would be the rule of 3. Now, the rule of 3 states that you should always use 3 different things. 3 different fonts, 3 different line weights, 3 different colors. 3 things is an appropriate amount of complexity and simplicity for the work you're doing. And as you're doing font combinations, you might want to think about this. What are the 3 types of information that I need to understand? We'll talk a bit about this more later, but for now, it's always a good idea to pick a body-based font, which is by far a serif-based font, and to pick a heading-based font, which is normally a sans serif-based font, and then pick one accent font, which could be any of these other types of fonts. Something that you can put in there that people understand the emotion or mood of what you're trying to do, instead of distracting them from what you're trying to say. Now, there's a couple of other points to make. There is a difference between system fonts and free fonts and also bad fonts. And for this, I'm going to note a couple of different fonts. So I'm going to change this first to Arial, which we have our filters on. So we need to clear all those. And then we'll go back and we'll type Arial. Now, this is in the Arial font, which is a standard font used. If you've ever heard of the font Helvetica or watched the documentary, you'll understand that both these fonts are very similar. Now, I'm just going to do a comparison here. The top one will be Helvetica and the bottom one will be Arial. We can see that they're different, right? It's the same text, the same organization, the same layout, but there are some slight differences in the fonts. This one, Helvetica, this one, Arial. Now, why does this matter? It matters because of the concept of system fonts. System fonts are fonts, like Arial, that have been bought and propagated throughout the world because they're on every computer or every system. Helvetica is a font that is purchased, that you have to actually pay for, and is professionally designed to look great all the time. So, if you're using a system font, whether consciously or unconsciously, your audience will know that and see it as the same thing they've seen all the time on every computer and every device that has been in the world, in their world. If you use something like Helvetica, again, consciously or unconsciously, they will notice the difference and notice the attention to detail that these professional designers have put into it. On top of this, of course, you have free fonts like the Google fonts that we talked about previously. There is some controversy over whether those fonts are legitimate, but the fact that they're open source does say that there's something important about the ability for people to use fonts and to share them with the rest of the world. Now, what are bad fonts? Well, let's look at one universally accepted bad font, which is the font Comic Sans. All right. Now, this font actually gets used a lot, and it was designed to be kind of universally accepted by everyone else. It gets used everywhere. I highly encourage you to look into it and to either continue making jokes about it or to understand why it's a bad font. What it boils down to, again, is overuse. And we can't express enough that overuse is an important concept to get away from when you're picking fonts. Of course, other bad fonts are fonts that are distracting, but this is a different version of bad font. bad font in this context is a font that simply is described as bad, as a joke, as some culturally accepted version of the norm that gets used without thinking about it. Whereas a bad use of font is picking a font that might be interesting or crazy and using it at a moment that's inappropriate. Using it when all the reader wants to do is try to understand what you're saying instead of look at some crazy font that means nothing to them. For example, chalk duster. Do you want to read a lot of this? No. This would be a bad use of a font, even though it's not a bad font. Let's move on to the second half of this discussion on text and type, and that's typography. Oops, still in my bad font. This probably isn't the best time to use it. I'm going to switch over to a font I like, which is not a decorative font. It is actually a simple font, which is Lato. This is a Google font that I've downloaded and chosen as one of my fonts to use. So I'll be using this for the next portion of our typography. You, of course, will need to choose what your own font is, and I encourage you to make that choice not only based on font, but also how does it participate in this next part of the conversation, which is topics of typography. Now, to do this, I'm going to create, with the Lato font selected, a large text box of font. Let's delete that typography there. Or actually, for the moment, let's just hide that. We'll probably come back to this concept in the fast, so we want to keep it there. But for the time being, we're going to look at a bunch of different font all at once and talk about various things that we get into when we're talking about the paragraphs or the collection of type and text. Now, previously we talked about the rule of 3, and in the rule of 3 you want to have 3 different fonts, or perhaps one font with different classes to it. For example, if we look at the Lato-based font, we see that there are 3 different classes to this font. We have Lato Light Italic, Lato Regular, and Lato Black. And these 3 might be used for very specific purposes. The basis of those purposes are headings, body text, and what can be described as focus or accents. So, a heading, of course, is simply a heading. It's a collection of a few words that doesn't last that long, that's just trying to introduce what's going on. And a focus text might be something that sits outside of the rest of everything else. Let's just make this a little bigger so we can see all of our text at once. And perhaps let's take our text tool and let's just define some focus text over here on the side. There we go. Also make this a little bigger. Well, we don't want to do this. Now we've destroyed our font. So be careful when you're using programs, especially programs like Illustrator that are not just dedicated to the word processing. We want to make sure that we use only a ability to edit the font without scaling or destroying what the designer of that font wanted. So for this discussion, we will have our heading here, we'll have our paragraph here, which is all collected into one, and then we will have a separate focus or highlight based text. To start, we will talk about the basics of body. Now this applies to heading and focus, but the simple basic, which we see over on the right here, after we get through the font section, is this text size or point size. Now, by default, it goes to 12 points. This is the standard way we view text. The 12-point font is very acceptably read, but there is a difference between print and web. Now, print can normally span between 10 and 12-point font for body-based text. I encourage everyone to think about using 10-point font as opposed to 12-point font. It is a much more comfortable font, and 12-point font has become a standard just based on a cultural norm that got propagated through different texts, different institutions, all this kind of stuff. So while 12-point font or 10-point font look different, make a choice based on what you want to do. Also make a choice based on the font and how it looks. Don't be afraid to use in-betweens. I actually tend to choose 10.5. I think it's a nice spacing for this font. I think it looks fairly good and clean, very minimal, easily read. It doesn't take up too much space or overpower anything else on the screen. Now, when you're doing web-based work, the font is standard to 15 to 25 points. So let's put this up to 15. The difference here is that we're normally sitting a little bit further away from our screens. We normally are maybe a little bit more lazy when we're looking at screens. When we're reading a book, we're very participatory or we're very intimate with that. Therefore, the smaller font can be much more helpful. Now, if you're working on different media types, not all of us are novelists, correct? Not all of us are web designers. But for this course, we're going to talk about a couple of things, which is portfolio design or board layout. For both those things, more than likely your documents will exist in between both print and physical. And when you're making these decisions, you should take a look at what is the difference. What am I making as my font, and how will it read better based on that point size? Now, point size isn't the only indicator in how the font looks. There's another very important aspect to font, and that is the line spacing. Many of us have probably heard about this as we were asked to either do single or double line spacing when we're writing papers or turning things in. The single or double line spacing, which is used in most other word processors, is a convention that should not be used when you're creating a designed layout, when you're doing the art of arranging type or typography. A better use is what defaults in these programs. So if we look over here and we see our point size, next to it we see the line spacing, and we can see that this is set to 12 points. If we turn our font point size up to a web-based thing, 14 point, we'll notice that that changes to 16.8. The ratio here is 120%. Now, we can play with this, and you should go between 120 and 145%. Luckily, programs like InDesign allow us to do calculations, 1.45. So now we have a larger line spacing, which perhaps might look better. Let's actually compare these two. Let's move this up here since we're not using it. We'll delete our header for the time being. Oops. There we go. And we're going to do a quick comparison to line spacing. So on the left, we have a line spacing of what is effectively 145%, a little bit of a larger line spacing, and here we're going to make this line spacing at what will be 120. So it's a little tighter, it's a little more dark. You can see that there's a value difference. Don't forget about the elements of design. And really, this just comes down to what font are you using and what do you want it to look like. All right, let's move on from line spacing, talk about some other important concepts. The next important concept is located right below this. We're going to skip over these. This is some aspects of the font, the spacing of the letters that you can get into. You can look into the resources we provided, but we're really just going to talk about this, which is paragraph. Now, we have a line left, which is the default. Of course, this means that there is a nice left edge. and that everything else on the right edge is left ragged or, kind of jogging back and forth. Lorem Ipsum, this free text, or this filler text, right, does a good job of showing us what something would look like without having to write it. And we can see that words and letters and all these different things, right, combine together in different ways. It's actually incredible how complex text is and type is. Perhaps we want this to be centered. Great. Everything is centered. Both edges are perfectly symmetrical. Looks excellent. This actually is a very common mistake. Centered text, really, there's no good reason to use this. It's hard to read. The eye is moving back and forth. It doesn't know where to land. It doesn't know where to start. And centered text should only really be used when you're having, for example, a heading like this, and this heading is aligned somewhere, but it spans the distance. Put this over here. We're not going to get too specific, and we'll drag out, oops. Sorry about this. Drag out this box so that, don't pay attention to that mistake there, the leader, so that the heading text is actually centered here. I'm going to turn this back to this, and I'm also going to turn this up to a much higher value so it looks like a header or a title. This would be an appropriate use of header text or centered text, because what I want to do is I want to indicate that everything below this, everything within this space, this frame, participates in this text, right? What we're calling out here. Then, as I move over in convention from left to right, my eye is able to find a similar place to land as I move across the screen. So, don't use centered text unless you have a very good reason, and the convention is to only use it for headers, to center them above a body paragraph. Of course, we can right justify it, might be interesting, but it doesn't go with convention. And then we have these fold justified texts. And the difference here is that the block of text looks very consistent. Now, if you are using fold justification so that the right edge and the left edge are the same, you may need to make sure you also have hyphenate turned on. Hyphenation is the ability for words to be divided by a hyphen so that they flow into the next line. If we turn that off, what we see is that it adds white space into our text. And we actually will get moments where the white space here looks very inappropriate. Now, this might be something you want to do. It's actually up to you. You can see different versions of this if you look in magazines or print media where they decide to use hyphenated or non-hyphenated. My preference, and as a general rule of thumb, is that if you're justifying text, you should hyphenate that text. Now we can center justify it, we can left justify it, or even fold justify it. But again, look at this. This fold justification gives us this really weird spacing at the end here. How does this make sense? And how does this let your reader understand what you're trying to say, as opposed for them asking, wait, why is gate, Noah, Facilla, are they separated for a reason? Does Noah have a relationship to this title up here because it's in the center? All these questions just confuse people. As you're working, the best way is to either decide, do I want it to be left justified with a ragged edge, or do I want it to be left justified with hyphenations in it? Now, we've talked about the whole body of text, but what about the difference between paragraphs, between topics? By default, we see that this is using a space between our paragraphs. If we go over here, we can see that this space is actually indicated by the, below here, space before paragraphs and space after paragraphs. Now there are two conventions to this. There is either the space after paragraphs. You don't want space before paragraphs unless you have a very good reason. Or there is the first line indent, but you don't want to use these in combination. Now the first line indent, we'll set this to 12, and that means that every new paragraph starts with an indent, and then there's a space between those. Do not use these in combination. I encourage you to go and look at books and media and all this stuff and understand that actually these are never used in combination. It's either one or the other. I'm going to turn off this, and we're going to see that this reads just fine. I can understand the different paragraphs. I use less space. This is commonly used in books, in novels, whereas the after paragraph, so we'll turn off our first line indent and turn this on. This is typically used in layouts, in print media, and things like that. Okay, so now that we've talked about the basic things to do and don't do with the body, we're going to talk about this header. Of course, we also had the accent font, which we've left alone for now. That is, well, like I mentioned, that is more about fonts and how you're creating accents. But for now, we're just looking at bodies of text that you might use to explain a work or to say something where you want to get your reader's attention and not let it go. So here's our heading. There's a lot of things we can do with our Lato text here. We can make it light italic, we can make it black, we can use regular. We can also come in to some other familiar options, which is down here. We have all caps, small caps, superscript, subscript, underline, strike through, and these are creating focus and attention. For example, I want the reader to know that this is the focus, so I'm going to underline it. All right, great, I have an underline. It's a nice version. I also perhaps have something important I want to say in here, so I'm going to again go in and I'm going to click on underline. There. Now my reader understands. This actually is a very common mistake to make. Underlining completely distracts from the beauty of the font and the typography that you've created. Underlining is a convention that occurred early on when typists didn't have the ability to use bold and italic because they weren't designed into the typefaces that they were using on the machinery or the typewriters. So what they would do is they would type their font out like this, and they would then go back over it and use the underscore to underline certain areas. Now the underline specifically has no relationship to the font itself. It's just a line. It's not designed to work with the font. It's this arbitrary graphic element that doesn't help. It doesn't make things easy. It actually is a bit too off-putting. Now, depends on who you are, but the general consensus is that if you're trying to make good font or good work, good type, don't use underline. I'll leave that decision up to you. For me, I'm going to turn it off. If it'll let me. Oh, now the whole thing's underlined. This is a terrible example. This is really bad. We can see that this is a just poor decision and does not reinforce our goal. So I'm going to turn these both off, make sure they're not underlined. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use the bold and italic. So here I'm going to make this black, which is a version of bold. There's much more complexity to this, different bolding of things. But now we can see that everything is reading with the same character, the same font choice, without introducing any new element that we have to wonder about or understand. Additionally, I might want to separate one word out of this. So in this case, I'm going to come in and use the light italic. And now again, we can see how much easier that comes across as someone's looking at this. They're not wondering how it participates in the larger thing, what the graphic elements are. Rather, they're just saying, as I come to this point in this text, there's something different here. Now, With Bolden Italic, a great way to think about the use of those is that if you're using a serif-based font, which is not this font, the italic works a lot better. It's much gentler, it makes sense, whereas bold is much heavier on serifs when we saw those blocky serifs and doesn't look as good. So if it's just body-based text and you have a serif-based font, do not use bold, rather use italic. If it is a sans serif-based font, italic doesn't typically get used unless you want to make a calmer statement, whereas the bold use is a much more pronounced version of it. Again, here, everything is participating in the same theme, the same design, without distracting from your message. The final thing that we're going to talk about is the implementation of all caps. Now, all caps is a very tempting version. And the reason why is because everything seems to be important. It's all in caps. We use capital letters to denounce proper nouns, to punctuate people's names. We use capital letters to start sentences. They are incredibly important. So why not just make everything all caps? That means that everything's important. This makes sense? All right. Well, does this look good to read? My intention, or my preference, is to start reading the all caps paragraph and just get tired. Every letter occupies the entire height of this paragraph or the line. As I move across, I'm having a hard time resting, and I'm just going to skim through this and then start to move back on to these other areas where I can see as I come across there's something that's important. I keep moving, I relax, I'm listening to what my author has to say. Interestingly enough, all caps got used within the legal scene, and a lot of work has been done to try and get away from that because it's a very kind of aggressive manner of using this form. So let's get rid of this paragraph and not use all caps. And we will use it up at the top here because all caps, while it is important, it works well for 2 or 3 words at a time. Again, we can see that this paragraph, what we've created, is very easy to look at and very simple, and it's not going to distract from the message we're having. Okay, let's wrap up this discussion. And let's just remember the things we talked about. We talked about using all caps, not within bodies, but as a very simple heading version. We've talked about bold and italic and why we should use those instead of underline. We talked about paragraphs, whether we should use a after paragraph space or a indent at the start of paragraph, but not both. We've also talked about left justified as a convention and only using centered or other versions when you have a good reason, or only using it to center title-based text on a paragraph. We talked about line spacing, how this needs to be decided in relationship to the font you're using, and not to use just single line or double line spacing, and of course point size, or the size of the font. This again relates back to the font you're using, what looks comfortable, but really that 10 to 12 points is the convention for print, while 15 to 25 is the convention for screen. Now, choose your fonts wisely. Fonts should be used to serve the purpose of what you're doing, not to be creative and expressive. You should be those things, but you should be those things without allowing them to distract from what you're saying. What you're trying to actually do with your text is to augment the work you have. Don't make it harder for your reader to participate with your work. Make it easier, and using these basic conventions will make that happen.